Of the six main types of teas, black tea is the best well known and most consumed outside of Eastern Asian countries. But because of its familiarity, its widely easy access, and the popularity of this beverage, we may not realize that there is still so much diversity in the types of black teas that are available. And so today we're going to be diving into the diverse world of black teas. I invite you to join me. Hello, tea lovers, and welcome to Rebecca's Tea Cozy, where we share a love of tea and other things that are cozy to nourish our bodies and our souls. In this series of Let's Talk Tea, we've been studying the six main categories of tea, and we've learned that all teas come from the Camellia sinensis plant. But what makes them different is the level of oxidation that they're allowed to go through. In today's episode, we'll be focusing on black tea, which is allowed to undergo the highest level of oxidation. Hence, why it's darker or more brown in color, because the leaves have been allowed to interact with the oxygen in the air and produce a brown leaf. Many of us enjoy a cup of black tea, especially in the morning, because it's known for its stronger, more intense flavor, and it's purported to have a higher caffeine content than most of the other teas that we've studied, however, not as high as coffee. We also enjoy a cup of black tea because it has that rich, malty flavor to it, or a sweet, caramelly cocoa flavor to it, a fruity hint in it. There are just a lot of different flavors that can come out of those black teas. And if you're not familiar with all of those flavor profiles, then this episode is for you. So tea is known to have originated in China. However, the black teas that China produces are primarily exported, while they themselves still primarily enjoy green teas. However, as they exported teas, or as they traded teas with other countries over the past thousands of years, they found that black tea was the best tea for export because of the oxidation that it underwent. It allows it to stay fresher and hold more flavor for a longer period of time. And in fact, they actually started compressing them into bricks, which went through a then fermentation process and developed into pu'er tea, which we're actually going to be studying shortly in one of our upcoming episodes. India is the second largest producer of black tea. However, they tend to consume it within their country, so not as much as exported. And then other countries that are high in export rates is African countries such as Kenya that have started producing tea and produce primarily for the teabag market or the larger tea company markets that are out there. So in today's episode, we're going to look at several different black teas. And as you can see, black tea is one of my favorite to enjoy, especially in the morning as that little pick-me-up. But we're going to look at several of the different black teas, the different countries that they come from, and how that impacts the flavor profile along with the process that it goes through. So I'm going to grab a couple teas for our focus today so we can begin to explore this diverse and wonderful world of black tea. So today we're going to highlight 3 different teas from 3 different regions across the world. The first tea is a Keemun tea, which is produced in China. And as we know, a lot of the teas that are produced in China come from the Camellia sinensis variety sinensis tea bush, which means that it has a little bit smaller leaves than those that are primarily produced in other regions of the world, such as India or the tea that we have focused here, which is Ceylon tea or from the island of Sri Lanka. Just as a note, Sri Lanka switched over from coffee production when there was a pestilence that came through and destroyed the majority of their crops, and they started producing tea. And so now they're very well known for their tea export and make very delicious teas based on the region and the climate that they have available. So this is a Ceylon tea, which is primarily using the Camellia sinensis variety Assamica plant. And you can see the difference between the Chinese black tea and the Ceylon black tea. And then we have a tea from India, from the Assam region, and this is Assam tea. And you'll notice the difference as well between this leaf compared to these leaves. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between these different leaves and then how they impact the teas when we get into our taste testing. So just like all teas, they have to be plucked. Now this is where there is an extreme difference in tea processing because black teas are the most popular, the most widely available, and they have very high-end black teas, of course, but then they're also the lowest quality as very large consumer tea makers, tea companies produce tea bags that have very small pieces or, like we've learned, even fannings and dust. So the plucking stage can be very fine, some of them being plucked just the buds. So for example, one of the teas that I have that I really enjoy is a golden bud tea. And it's actually just the bud, as in the silver needle that we learned about that has those white downy feathers, but then it's oxidized, which is a very tricky process to oxidize those buds. But it creates a golden color, a golden hue, and a really sweet flavor to the tea. So, but then it can also be large machine plucking, which can just shear off everything. So you get 4 to 5 leaves potentially, plus some twigs and some stems. And so there's not a lot of quality in that at all. So there's those two gamuts and of course everything in between. So there's the plucking stage. And then the other important part of the black tea stage is the withering process. And it's allowed to wither for an extended period of time to allow the leaves to soften and then to be able to be rolled. And this rolling stage is really critical because that's what bruises the cell walls. It's what bruises or breaks apart the leaves to then allow oxidation to occur. So the rolling stage is where we find two distinct methods of producing black tea. So all black tea is plucked, and it depends on the quality. All black tea is allowed to wither, but then this rolling stage is where there are two main processes. One is the orthodox method, which if you think about a rolling machine that just rolls the leaves and kind of bruises them, or somebody is actually hand rolling the leaves and bruising them and crushing them so that they release juices, which will then oxidize based on the oxygen in the air. But there's also another method called CTC, or cut, tear, curl. And that's where the leaves are put into a machine that does just that. It cuts them, it chops them into small pieces, it breaks them, and what's left are small pieces of leaves that then, of course, because they're all broken, will also oxidize. And then all tea, whether they've gone through a rolling stage or a CTC process, then they are dried when the tea maker decides that the appropriate flavor profile, the level of oxidation has reached what he's desiring for that outcome of tea. And this is the stage, that drying stage has to be just right, especially with your higher quality teas that are produced. The tea maker will continue to go back and constantly check to make sure that those leaves are just right. Because if it undergoes too much oxidation, it may create a more bitter flavor or maybe not much flavor at all. But if it undergoes too little of an oxidation phase, then it might be sour or not have the flavor that's desired. So it's a tricky time that takes a lot of skill and knowledge to get the exact flavor that's desired. So let's look at the leaves now and how they are different based on where they're coming from and what process is used. If you look at the Chinese black tea or the Keemun tea, you'll notice that it's a smaller leaf than the Ceylon tea. You can tell that both of them have been rolled. This one is very tightly rolled, looks almost like a needle, and it's smaller than the Ceylon leaf. And again, this would be from the variety sinensis plant, whereas this would be from the variety Assamica plant, which has larger leaves. The Assamica variety of tea plant is going to produce a richer, darker, more intense brew because of the larger leaves of the plant itself. And so teas that are produced with the Assamica plant are going to have a more hearty, more bold, more malty, more intense flavor, and also potentially a higher caffeine content because of that. If you look at the Assam tea that we have here, you can see that it's broken bits of tea. And this would be the CTC method, where it's not a rolling process left to oxidize, but it's actually chopped pieces and then left to oxidize. So this tea you can easily see distinct from these two. And of course, because it's smaller pieces, it's going to brew more quickly, it's going to release color more quickly, and it's going to have a more intense flavor at a quicker rate. So these types of teas will stand up to the addition of milk and sugar, or in the country of India, they enjoy chai, which again is an infusion of spices, sweetener, and a milk with it. And so it's a heartier brew, it's a stronger brew, and of course, British love their dark hearty brews with milk and sweetener to it. Another step in the black tea processing is after they've been dried, the leaves are sorted, and that's because, as we just said, tea leaves will steep at different rates based on the size of the leaf. So they're sorted into the different sizes. And of course, the larger sizes are going to be a higher quality tea. The smaller sizes typically are going to be a little bit lower quality of a tea. And there's actually an entire grading process that takes place outside of China. China's teas are not graded this way, but a lot of teas that are produced in, let's say, Kenya or India or Sri Lanka are graded on this very complex system. You may be familiar or have heard of the term orange pekoe, and orange pekoe is kind of the baseline. So anything above that would be a higher quality tea, and as you move below that, the word broken orange pekoe or broken flowery orange pekoe is added in. And so that tells you what level of tea you're drinking. So for example, this particular tea, you'll see the letters FBOP, which stands for flowery broken orange pekoe. And so that is a grading that you may see on some black teas, but again, primarily outside of the teas that are produced in China. And it's a very complex system that not a lot of people necessarily are aware of or know about, but if you are, or if you're curious about it, you can look into that. As you move further down that system, you'll also, after the broken stage, get to the fanning stage and the dust stage. And if you tuned into the episode on loose leaf versus tea bags, you heard us say that a lot of the tea bags are produced by those fannings, or actually the dust that's left from sorting the larger pieces out and just having a low quality product to put inside of the tea bags. And this CTC method actually came about around the time that tea bags became popular in the 1950s. And so those two kind of grew together hand in hand. So tea bags will give you that dark brew, it'll give you a quick brew, it'll give you an intense brew, but it's not necessarily going to give you the tea with the highest quality and best flavor. Let's now give these teas a try. So we're going to brew the teas, and then we'll look at the color profile and see how the process that it goes through, as well as the plant and the region that it comes from, impacts that color as well as the flavor. I'll be right back. So I have our three teas in front of us: Assam, which is from India, Ceylon, which is from Sri Lanka, and Keemun, which is from China. And black teas are recommended to be steeped at the boiling point, which is about 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius. Now, there are some people that will also recommend that your black teas are between 195 and 205 degrees Fahrenheit. But all of these teas, even on their packaging, do recommend boiling. So I have heated the tea to the boiling point. We're going to put these in our teacups and steep for about 3 minutes. So the amount of water to leaf ratio is mainly dependent on your preference. And then, of course, it's also dependent on whether you're using a Western style brewing or an Eastern or Gong Fu style brewing, which is, a smaller amount of leaf to a larger amount of water, such as in Western style. So this might be about a teaspoon of tea for 6 ounces of water, whereas when I'm making a Chinese tea, it might recommend 3/4 of a tablespoon of tea to the same amount of water. So that will also then determine how long you let the tea steep for. Again, for today, I'm letting them steep 3 minutes. A lot of times you'll see recommended 3 to 5 minutes, and it's really preferential on your taste. The smaller amount of tea, you're going to let it steep longer. The larger amount of tea, you're going to let it steep a little less. And it's also dependent on the intensity of the flavor that you want. So a lot of times with black tea, I use a little bit larger amount and I let it steep maybe about a minute. And that's typically around good for me. With each subsequent steeping, then I increase that time just a little bit to continue to get flavor out of it. The other thing that will impact the steeping is also the size of the leaves. So remember, with those tea bags that are just dust or fannings inside, they steep and give out their color very quickly. Whereas a tea that's a larger leaf, such as the Ceylon tea, it's going to take a little longer for those leaves to unfurl and give off their flavor. So that will also impact how long you're going to let your tea steep for, based on the type of hopefully loose leaf tea, as we've learned that usually gives you the highest quality of flavor. The tea leaves, the shape, size, how tightly they're rolled is going to also impact your steeping time. So just know that it really is about experimenting. And there's our timer. So let's go ahead and pour our teas in. So these 2 teas come from the Camellia sinensis variety Assamica plant, which has larger leaves, while this tea comes from the Camellia sinensis variety sinensis plant, which has the smaller leaves. That is definitely going to impact the flavor profile and potentially the color of the tea. In addition, just by looking at the wet tea leaves, you can see, as we said, that this is the CTC method, or the cut, tear, curl, as all of those leaves are very small and broken. Not that that's a bad thing if the flavor that you want is to have a quick, more intense, stronger brew, but that is the method that this tea has used. Whereas you can see in the Ceylon tea that's unfurled, as well as the Keemun tea that has unfurled, this one has smaller leaves than this one, and these leaves are a little bit more whole than these leaves are, a little more intact, and these were a little more tightly rolled than these were, which can sometimes speak to the quality of the tea that's being produced, or the tea maker. So let's do the aroma scent before we get into the flavors. The Assam tea. Definitely has a nice, warm, little bit of a spicy note. It smells a little bit like toast, which sometimes is the flavor that will come out with a black tea. The Ceylon tea. This has a very different scent and aroma than this tea. It smells a little fruity. And I want to say fresh, although I'm not quite sure that's the right word because a lot of times we're using that with green teas that are spring and floral, fresh flavored. But it smells a little fresher, fresh, like fresh air scent, clean scent, than this tea, which had a little bit more warm, spicy notes. Definitely picking up some fruitiness there. And then lastly, the Camellia sinensis Keemun tea. Yet again, very different from both of these teas. It's almost like a sweet cooked fall vegetable, which has that robust but sweet, intense um, roasted flavor. And yes, definitely a sweetness there, maybe a little bit of a malty smell. Mm, very pleasant. So let's look at the color of the liqueur before we begin drinking the teas to taste them. So again, we would expect that the tea that is broken the most or has the smallest pieces is going to have that darker, more intense brew typically, and also knowing that the Assam teas are created in order to have that deeper, richer, more intense brew that will stand up to the milk and sweetener that is typically known to be a British style of drinking tea. We also know that the Indian teas, a lot of them are consumed within the country by the people of India. So they enjoy chai tea, which again, you want to add those spices, those rich, deep, warm spices along with milk. So you want a tea that's going to stand up with a lot of intensity to complement that intense and flavorful beverage. So you'll notice that this is a darker tea than both the Ceylon tea as well as the Keemun tea. And that is what you'll typically find is the teas that are produced in the CTC method as well as from the Assamica variety. Typically will tend to have that darker, more intense flavor be closer to the amber or brown or deep orange, whereas the other teas, the Ceylon tea actually is a little lighter because, again, I'm going to partly attribute that to the large size of the particle leaf, which will cause it to brew more slowly as the leaves unfurl and extract the flavor and the color. I believe I mentioned that in China, they actually call this red tea, not black tea, because of the color is typically that red or golden, orangey sunrise color or amber hue, rather than an intense, brisk, dark tea. Now, none of these are super dark. There are times that you will steep a tea bag, and if you leave it in for a while, or if you were to steep some of these teas, especially this tea, for a longer time period, like 5 to 6 minutes, then it is going to have that deeper, darker, closer to dark brown color of the liquid. So let's get into tasting the tea, our favorite part. It does have that toast taste, kind of that buttery toast taste to it. So it's perfect with a breakfast, which Assam tea is actually one of the main teas in the British breakfast blend or an English breakfast blend. It relies a lot on the Assam variety of tea. It may come out of India or it may come from Kenya or Tanzania, other countries in Africa that are producing black teas now, especially on the larger commodity scale. It's warm, has a spicy note, and there's also some astringency that I notice in the middle of my tongue, which it's not bitter, but it does have some astringency, which are the tannins in the tea. smooth but a little dry on the tail end, which again isn't necessarily a negative thing. It's just one of the profiles of the flavor of this tea. And you can compare it, as we have before, to wines. There are wines that are sweet and fruity. There are wines that are dry. There are wines that are smooth. So it's just lends to the diverse flavors that are available in the tea market. This is a Ceylon tea. It's definitely smoother than this tea on the tongue. It's not as astringent as the Assam tea is. It also has some malty notes in the flavor. If you think like Whopper candies, if you're familiar with those, they are malt balls covered in chocolate. So it has a little bit of that malt flavor. And now the Keemun tea. Definitely like that roasted, almost like a roasted pumpkin or butternut squash flavor to it. Sweet, warm, intense, flavorful, no bitterness or astringency at all in this tea. And the interesting thing is, prior to the colonization of India by the British, when they started producing and exporting tea from India, they actually were exporting tea from China. And the Keemun tea, this particular tea, is the primary tea that they would use for their English breakfast tea. So this was the true original English breakfast tea until the British colonized India, began producing tea and being able to export it, trying to kind of overthrow or work around the monopoly that China had on the tea market. And so that's when the Assam tea became the popular tea of choice for that British breakfast tea. So I would say no matter which of these three teas that you choose to drink, whether for your morning pick me up or along with breakfast or maybe perhaps an afternoon tea, any of them would be an excellent choice. They all have lovely flavors that would be a great complement to a meal, or again, as a pick me up in the morning, or just to sip on throughout the day. Now, black tea is something that I don't typically drink past around 1 or 2 o'clock, because sometimes I will notice that that caffeine will impact me. But again, the caffeine content is personal. Some people aren't impacted by it at all, and others can't have any past 11 a.m. or it's going to keep them up all night. And again, remember that caffeine content is not dependent on one sole contributing factor, like it being black tea. Although black tea is known to have the highest quantity of caffeine, which is still about half of the caffeine amount in a cup of coffee. However, again, black teas are all different depending on where they come from, the size of the leaf, the maturity of the tea leaves themselves, the environment that they're grown in, whether they're high mountain teas or low, closer to sea level teas, cold environment, warm environment, how small the leaf is cut. There are so many factors to it. And as we've also learned that, a white silver needle with those young, immature buds that are being plucked may have a higher caffeine content than a black tea that has a little bit more mature leaves. So it's difficult to pinpoint if this tea has the same amount of caffeine as this one. So it really is about kind of knowing what your body is, how your body responds to the teas that you're drinking, and just pay attention to that for you. And remember, as with everything, it's in moderation. So caffeine can be something positive for your body, as it gives you that boost of energy or alertness or focus or concentration. But again, moderation is key. The other health benefits of black tea are numerous, just like greens and whites. Although green and white is purported to have some higher levels of antioxidants and beneficial flavonoids that help our body in a variety of ways, black tea also is known to have some very beneficial properties because, again, it comes from the tea plant, which is the basis for all of these life giving, life sustaining, and healing properties to our body. Now, black tea actually has another flavonoid that comes out as a result of the oxidation process that green and white don't have, and that's called theaflavin. And so it has beneficial properties on its own. And I'm not a scientist, I haven't done a lot of research, so I'm not going to go too far into the benefits of that. You can certainly research it for yourself, or I'll take some time to research it and come back and do another episode on all the different polyphenols, flavonoids that are within the different types of tea. But just know that black tea isn't some drink that's harmful to your body and doesn't have any positive qualities. But again, remember, we've talked a lot about the quality of the tea that you're drinking. So if you're drinking fannings and dusts that are left over from a quality tea production, then those aren't going to have the health benefits and the qualities from the tea plant itself that's life-giving to your body. You're going to want to select those teas that are high quality, that are produced by reputable sources, that don't have chemicals and terrible things in the processing of the tea that can be harmful to you, but truly selecting teas that are going to help restore your body and give nutrients into your system. So I hope that you've learned something that you can take away today. I'd love to hear from you in the comments whether or not you have a favorite black tea, and if so, what it is. What do you enjoy about that particular cup of black tea? You can also reach out to me directly at rebecca@rebeccasteacozy.com. And I'll look forward to seeing you for our standing reservation right here at Rebecca's Tea Cozy next Wednesday. And until then, be blessed with a cup of tea.